Hello friends, welcome to Houseplant Tips and Tricks. My name is Nick and today we're going to discuss care differences between houseplants and succulents. This series is sponsored by repotme.com. Get all of your indoor gardening supplies delivered to your door from one place. Repotme.com has practically anything you need for your orchids, succulents, and houseplants, including handmade potting mixes, planters, fertilizers, and much more. I think one of the main differences we're first going to come across between succulent and houseplant care is going to be the soil that you use and the planter material that you pick for your plants. So I would be safe to assume that when you're out at a houseplant store shopping, after you've picked out the plant or the succulent or the cactus that you're going to want to bring in your home, the next step is going to be picking a planter for your plant and perhaps also picking a soil for that plant as well. First things first, regardless if you're going to be caring for a houseplant or succulent, you need to make sure that the planter that you pick out has a drainage hole. This is a must. All plants' roots need to breathe, they need to have proper airflow, and they need to drain properly. Waterlogged or soggy, wet soil is going to be the #1 killer for plants in your home. Doesn't matter if it's a cactus or a succulent, doesn't matter if it's a houseplant, and obviously, or maybe not obviously, maybe I'm here to tell you this today, but succulents and cacti grow in a more arid environment in their natural habitat. So of course these are going to want to be on the drier side, and houseplants might prefer to be in more moist or wetter soil depending on the type of plant, but no plant wants to be sitting in wet, soggy, waterlogged soil, especially if there's no drainage hole. That's just going to exacerbate the issues tenfold. So pick a planter with a drainage hole. If you find a planter that doesn't have a drainage hole, it's considered a cache pot or a cache pot, and that is more for decorative purposes, not for planting directly inside. You would just place your plant in the plastic nursery planter inside the planter with no drainage holes. I just heavily persuade you to never plant anything directly inside a planter without a drainage hole. It's just going to cause you more problems than not. But that's where our care for succulents and houseplants is going to start to diverge. We will cross paths every once in a while. But continuing on with the planters, you might notice that most of the planters over here in my succulent and cacti selection are unglazed ceramic or terracotta versus the ones over here are kind of a mix of unglazed ceramic, terracotta, and glazed ceramic. And there's good reason for that. Succulents and cacti, as I previously mentioned, in their natural habitat are growing in much more arid conditions than the houseplants are, in most cases at least. But since these do prefer drier conditions all around, utilizing a unglazed ceramic or a terracotta planter is going to really help you out, since the unglazed ceramic is porous. So it's actually going to suck some of the moisture out from the soil, which can give you some leeway if you've maybe been a little too heavy-handed. It's going to be the opposite with glazed ceramics or plastics and other materials like glass or metals. They are not porous, they are not going to suck any of the moisture out, so it's all going to be contained. So that might be better for houseplants like a fern over here that's going to appreciate some more moist soil. And you can obviously be using your best judgment on that. You might see I have this Tom's Thumb Crassula right here in this glazed ceramic planter, even though this is a very succulent houseplant. But this planter is teeny tiny. There's like a 1/4 cup of soil in here. This thing is not going to stay wet for too long, especially since I'm subjecting it to brighter light conditions. We will touch on the light later on in this video. If you are working with a planter that is 6 inches in diameter or larger, that's when I'm heavily going to recommend using something unglazed for your succulents and cacti. I think you have a little bit more wiggle room for options when it comes to houseplants. Some are going to be fine in unglazed ceramic or glazed ceramic or any material. You might just have to adjust the soil accordingly. So getting into the soil, as I mentioned with succulents and cacti for like the 3rd time, they're growing in their desert conditions, the arid conditions. So these are going to want some really sandy, rocky soils in most situations. The soil that I'm using in my home for all my cacti and succulents is from repotme.com. I use the classic succulent and cacti mix. I really enjoy it because it's got a good amount of sand, it's got a good amount of perlite, a good amount of pumice in there, so lava rocks that are really porous and also going to add a lot of airiness and chunkiness to the soil. You can see here with my Sansevieria pinguicula in particular just how rocky this soil is and how much this appreciates the rocky conditions, as you can see with it putting off this nice little baby plant right here that I'm just so excited about. The soil is good right from the back. I have no problems with it. But if you're working with extra succulent houseplants like the Sansevieria pinguicula, for example, I might go ahead and add a couple extra spoonfuls of perlite or pumice into my mixture, which is also available on repotme.com, just to give the soil a little extra aeration. But most of these other plants, like this Tom's Thumb Crassula, the blue cactus, and the Euphorbia, the 3 in the front row, are going to be perfectly fine with the soil straight from the the bag. This soil particularly, if you are getting your soil from like a big box store and using those mass-produced brands, I would always amend those. Those are always going to be too heavy for any houseplant, so always add some extra sand, perlite, or pumice, but this Repot Me Succulent Cactus Classic Mix is good perfectly straight from the bag. For the houseplants, I use the Houseplant and Tropical Classic Mix from repotme.com. Also has a really good amount of perlite in the mixture and is perfectly suitable to use straight from the bag. If you're working with plants that prefer a little extra moisture, I'd throw in a handful of Sphagnum Moss into the mixture. If you're working with plants that prefer a drier soil or a more well-aerated soil mixture, you can go ahead and, just like with the succulents and cacti, add a couple extra spoonfuls of perlite or pumice, or even some orchid bark into the mixture. But one of the reasons why I've had such good success with these soil mixes right here is because they are coconut coir based soils. A lot of the soils that you're going to find ready to go at your big box stores are going to be peat moss based soil. And coconut coir is not only going to be more sustainable than peat moss, but it has a much more appropriate water retention than peat moss. So I just find myself overwatering and underwatering my plants much less often ever since I've been using this coconut coir based mix. But the type of soil that you're using, in addition to the planter material that you're going to be planting up your plants with, might be just playing a much larger role in plant care than perhaps you previously thought. Because what these both have in common with the way that you're caring for your plants is how it's affecting the moisture that your plant is holding on to. And as I mentioned like 6 times now, that cacti and succulents are going to prefer drier soil and drier air, while in most cases houseplants are going, or tropical plants are going to prefer more humid conditions and more moist soil. And there is one more very large factor that is really playing a very large role in how we are watering our plants, or how often or how much, and that is the lighting conditions. I'm convinced that lighting conditions are going to be the most important factor when it comes to caring for your plants. I would say the planter material is going to be the first thing, second is going to be the soil, third is going to be the lighting. So if you're doing the other two wrong, you best be doing the light conditions correctly. So for the succulents and cacti, as you could perhaps surmise from me talking about all of the arid conditions that these are subject to in their natural habitats, these are also going to thrive in brighter light conditions. I feel the need to drive that point home because the amount of times back when I worked at a plant store that people would come in and I'd hear them talking to their friends like, oh, you should get this succulent or this cactus for your desk at work because it doesn't need any light and it doesn't need any water. Incorrect. So these are going to need to be subject to the highest light conditions that you have in your home. If you are in the northern hemisphere, a south-facing window is going to be perfect, a west-facing or east-facing window will be perfectly fine, and a north-facing window might just not cut it because a north-facing window in the northern hemisphere is going to be receiving no direct sunlight, while south-facing windows are going to be receiving direct sunlight all day. That is the opposite in the southern hemisphere, but the east and west-facing windows are going to be the exact same because the sun still rises and sets on the same side for both of us. So you're definitely going to want to subject these to the brightest windowsill that you have in your home. A windowsill is going to be best. I wouldn't even really consider pulling them off a couple feet from your window unless you're supplementing them with a grow light, because these plants are really receiving a lot of sun in their natural habitat. A lot of these will sun stress beautifully, meaning the color of their leaves might change as they're getting kind of bleached out from the sun. And the ones like this Tom's Thumb Crassula right here, do you see how tight it's growing, how close the leaves are together? You want this to be in the brightest light that you can have, because if you do not, there's going to be much more space in between where each leaf is growing, and you're going to end up with a stretchy, not so good looking houseplant that's not going to be as happy with you as it was when it was growing in those conditions, when it was in the greenhouse or the nursery or wherever it came from. There are absolutely some succulents and cacti that will be okay if you pull them just a little bit away from the window, but any of these ones that have a very tight geometry or architecture to them, the brightest light is going to be your best bet. You can also kind of use the foliage color of your succulents or cacti to kind of get a better understanding of what the light conditions that they want to receive. So if you are working with a much more deep green plant, like this Hoya australis right here, the deeper green leaves is signifying to me that doesn't require as much bright sunlight as some other ones. Maybe if a plant had some blue foliage to its leaves, or some brown foliage to its leaves, or some white or pink to its leaves, these are going to require that bright sunlight to hold up their color. If you do not subject these plants to the bright light that they require, they will get stretched out and they will lose that color and fade back to more of a green coloration, which just isn't really what you signed up for. I think a really great example of succulents that require that bright light settings and have those bright colors, or like pastel-y colors, are echeverias, with those round, geometric, very architectural shapes to them and those bright colors. But if you just put that on your desk in your office without any light, not only is that plant going to lose that tight architecture and get stretched out and admittedly kind of ugly, it's also going to lose that bright, lovely pastel color and fade back to a dull green or just a duller version of itself. If you don't have bright enough light for a specific succulent or cacti, I would probably just recommend skipping it, because at the end of the day, it's not going to do it any justice when 6 months down the line you have a pinky finger thin cactus when it once was as thick as a cucumber. And moving on to the houseplants, we are going to have some similarities but differences as well. The houseplants are going to want to be grown in more of the interior of your space. There are going to be some plants that will appreciate growing in a window, more the north, east, and west facing windows if you're in the north hemisphere, while succulents are going to thrive in those sun-drenched south facing windows. Houseplants would burn. These leaves are much thinner. They don't have that kind of succulence and are not receiving that kind of sunlight in their natural habitat, because many of these are growing in like the understory of the rainforest, where there's a huge layer of tree canopy above them that's blocking out the sunlight and causing it to be just heavily dappled. So growing your houseplants in the interior of your space is where you're going to find the most success. When it comes to windowsills, north facing windows are great. East facing windows and west facing windows are going to be fine as well. But just like I was saying, the south facing windows will absolutely burn these leaves, so you want to pull them back probably at least like 2 to 4 feet from a south facing window just to avoid those harsh sun rays. But inside a north facing window, where it's all just bright indirect light all day and no direct sunlight, that's going to be an area where these plants can thrive. Now when it comes to the colors of the plants, it's going to also kind of differ in ways from the succulents and cacti. Where it's similar is that if you find a very green plant like the Asplenium fern that I have up here, or my Aglaonema pictum that I have back here, these are very green plants, and the greener the plant, just like I was saying with the Hoya australis, the less light it can handle. So these two plants are ones that I have both growing in the interior of my space, not close to any windows, and they're doing just fine. But when it comes to the color of the foliage with your houseplants, it might be telling you a couple different clues as to what kind of light your plants might appreciate. So you can see this Philodendron atabapoense as well as this Ludisia discolor is sporting much different color scheme than the Aglaonema or the fern or the Begonia. And if you're using these same context clues from the succulents that I was just saying, you might surmise that these are going to appreciate higher light conditions. And that might not necessarily be the case. So with these two plants in particular, they sport this wonderful red coloration on the back side of the leaves, and this is something that's pretty common with a lot of houseplants. You're going to see this with some prayer plants, some syngoniums, plenty of philodendrons as well. Now this in particular is kind of the clue as to this is more of a medium light houseplant, because in its natural habitat it's using the back sides of these leaves with that bright coloration to catch the sunlight back into the leaf. If I was to put this in a bright windowsill, from assuming with the pinks and purples and reds that it has on its leaves, I might be very disappointed when I have a sun-bleached houseplant over the next couple of days. Same with the Philodendron atabapoense. But you might find some houseplants, I think Aglaonema is a really great example of this, just like how I was mentioning the Echeveria. Now this is a very green Aglaonema. You're going to find plenty of Aglaonemas out there on the market though that might sport some pink or red or white or orange. So many colors out there of foliage. Those ones are going to prefer some brighter light conditions. Now the difference between those red leaves and these red leaves is that this just has the red hiding on the back. If the coloration is more on the front of the leaves, think like a brightly colored ficus, like Ficus ruby or Teneki, the variegated ficus, those are going to appreciate some brighter light conditions. So while this Aglaonema pictum right here is going to be considered a low to medium light houseplant from this just heavy green foliage, the Aglaonema red emerald that I'm showing you on screen right now is going to be considered a medium to bright indirect light houseplant, because it's got all that bright coloration and it's lacking that chlorophyll that the plant needs to photosynthesize to its full stability. This is also going to apply to variegated plants very popular plants out there with the white splotches all over the leaves. Wherever those white splotches are, there is a lack of chlorophyll, which means that the plant needs to work harder and receive more sunlight in order to grow to its fullest potential. But this is all going to bring us back to the watering. So the planter material, the soil consistency, and the lighting conditions that the plants are receiving are all going to wholly affect the way that this plant is processing the water. And I think it's very important that we understand that, because back when I worked at a plant store, the question I would get most often about a plant is, how often do I water it? And the answers to that are extremely subjective, because it really depends on your planter material, the soil consistency, and the lighting. So while you can get pushed in the right direction for how often to water something, and while I can say without a doubt that succulents and cacti are going to want to be watered less often than your houseplants and tropicals, I can't tell you exactly what that difference is going to be, because if you have your Sansevieria pinguicula planted inside a ceramic planter with just some normal soil, and your Aglaonema planted inside a terracotta planter, I know this is inside a terracotta, I'm just saying for an example, this might hold on to moisture the same way that this holds on to moisture, and they might still want to be watered in the same exact manner, when in reality this is a plant that wants brighter light conditions and drier soil, more aerated soil. So you just gotta keep everything in mind. But I think this is where we're going to wrap up today's video on the differences between houseplant and succulent care. I really hope you learned something today, because I think I spat out a lot of valuable information. But thank you so much for joining me today. I will leave all of the products I mentioned from repotme.com linked in the description below, and if you make any purchases through those links, I will receive a commission, so thank you so much. And I will do you one better by offering you a discount code. You can use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix from repotme.com. Thank you again for repotme.com for sponsoring today's video. If you don't already, you can follow me on Patreon for even more houseplant content. Subscribe to my TikTok and Instagram at phillyfoliage. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.